Joining us now, Senator Mark Warner, Democrat for Virginia. The senator is up for re-election November of 2014. Virginia's senior senator. I remind that to Tim Kaine every time I have him on. Hey, Senator, great to have you with us.
Thank you, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. I want to get right to your cybersecurity with Republican Senator from Illinois, Kirk, in the Ukraine. Tell us how that's going to be a game changer there.
Well, John, first of all, sorry about the drop calls. For somebody who made my living in the cell phone business, you'd think I'd know how to have phones that didn't drop all the time. Here's what we called for. I think this week the Senate is going to debate and I believe move forward on an aid package to Ukraine. I think it's important that we do that. We've got a new government in Ukraine who's pro-Western. The problem is the previous regime, under President Yanukovych, basically turned a blind eye to the cyber criminal activity that was going on in there. And I think probably many of your listeners remember the Target breach that close to 70 million numbers were hacked into in December. All that originated out of Ukraine. Matter of fact, depending on the ranking, Ukraine is always in usually the top 5 countries in terms of origin of cybercrime. And some of these were probably even supported by the previous regime. We're saying if we're going to, it seems to me like to be a no-brainer. Mark Kirk and I are saying if we're going to give you aid, new government, we want you to stand up and join a more pro-Western regime of governments. You got to help us though work on getting rid of this criminal element. You need to work with our law enforcement. We need an extradition treaty so that if we can arrest some of these hackers, that we can bring them to justice. And again, just common sense cooperation on something that is going to be increasingly both a criminal threat and also a national security threat.
So tying that to the aid package for the Ukraine, your leader, Harry Reid, now backing off on some of the IMF reforms the Senate wanted. Do you have a problem with that?
Well, on the IMF reforms, I know they were bipartisan supported. I thought that Senator Corker and I think Senator McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham supported some of those IMF reforms. I've not dug into all of the particulars. I do think if that was going to hold up the bill in the House, let's move forward on it. My concern is there may be some effort to try to, again, limit amendments. So I would like to get a vote on our amendment. I think it would pass overwhelmingly. But if it doesn't, then we also, Mark Kirk and I wrote the administration and said as well, you administration, if this aid package comes through, you can make part of this contingent upon cooperation from the new regime against cyber criminals. To me, this is just common sense. We're talking about close to $1 billion in aid. The Europeans are talking about a similar amount. The listeners should remember that Putin had offered $15 billion to the previous government, so this is a lot smaller than what Putin had offered.
Right.
But we do think the Europeans ought to be working with us as well on going after these cyber criminals. I might point out as well, John, that the week before, I've got 2 bipartisan issues with Ukraine. I teamed up with John Hoeven, Republican senator from North Dakota, and said to the administration, if we're gonna send a long-term message to Putin that we are serious, let's increase America's natural gas exports to Europe. The administration has approved 6 of these requests. There are about another 20 pending. We said, let's approve them all or tell us why not. Let's try to decouple Europe and Ukraine's dependence upon Russia in terms of their energy supplies.
Makes sense. Common Sense News Time, May 25. This is the John Fredericks Show with U.S. Senator Mark Warner from Virginia. Senator Vladimir Putin making some moves now. Anything about Putin and what he's doing that is keeping you up at night?
Well, obviously, when you've got a regime like Russia that, I think people view Putin as, I think he's a bully. I think he is someone who is trying to, demonstrate to his people this notion of kind of going almost back to the Soviet Union days. Obviously, Russia still has a large number of nuclear weapons. But I think we also need to bear in mind that Putin is doing this in many ways not from a position of strength, but from a position of weakness. His economy is pretty much in a tailspin. There's been, for Russia, at least on Russian standards, there have been fairly large protests against him, and this when Ukraine wanted to move so closer to Europe, Ukraine and Russia have a very close relationship. I'm not making an exact comparison to the United States and Canada, but it would be somewhat if Canada suddenly looked like they were, going to be tilting towards, Russia, tilting towards China. I think Putin is flailing around a little bit here, and somebody flailing with the armed forces he's got, it means he's dangerous. I do think that there ought to be more. For example, one of the things that I wish we would be doing more with is tightening up sanctions on the close to 200 oligarchs, these very, very wealthy people who've plundered Russia's economy, many of them who prop up Putin. The challenge with that, quite honestly, is as you go into it, is you look that most of these oligarchs have got their money in London, and that would have a very challenging effect on the British economy. So,
right.
This is one where we do, I think, have to continue to work with our European allies. Russia has more influence over Europe because they depend on Russian energy, because a lot of the Russian money is parked in Europe. But I'm glad to see, and I hope the president, while he's over in the EU, is trying to build support for tighter sanctions. And I was glad to see finally that he did make energy security one of the top items on the agenda. This, Putin wouldn't be doing this if he did not have if he wasn't so awash in profits from his energy supplies.
Right, no question. Senator, we got about 3 minutes. I want to shift domestically, go to Obamacare.
Sure.
It's come up on its 4-year anniversary. When you voted on that, you were one of the last holdouts. I've always thought that you were looking at it. You knew it had some issues. You're a business guy. It's on its 4-year anniversary. You voted for it. Any regrets?
John, I wish the rollout had been better. I wish the bill had been bipartisan, because any big piece of legislation like this is going to have problems. I do think we're not going to go back to the days when people were prohibited from getting health care if they had a pre-existing condition, or women were charged higher rates, or kids being on their parents' plan until 26. I don't think, even if the Senate goes the other direction, you're going to suddenly see this law be repealed. I do think there needs to be a lot of fixes. I'm going to be laying out later this week, actually, hopefully tomorrow or Friday, an op-ed with a couple of other senators on some specific items. Let me go through a couple of them on the phone. There ought to be more choice in the plans right now, instead of just the platinum, gold, silver, bronze. There ought to be a cheaper plan. If people want to buy a kind of a catastrophic plus, we're going to call it a copper plan. We think we ought to get rid of some of the reporting requirements on small businesses that are overly burdensome. We think we ought to go ahead and move the mandate on businesses only up to 100 employees, not 50. That would take care of about somewhere between 95 and 98% of American businesses would be excluded. We think we ought to go after allowing insurance companies to sell insurance across state lines. That's an idea that a lot of our Republican colleagues have trumpeted. So I think we're going to rapidly enter into a phase here where there's going to be 3 groups in the Congress. One group who says, hey, we don't want to touch a word of it. One group who says, hey, the only option is total repeal, even though the total repeal group never comes up with a solution of what you're going to replace it with. And then I think there'll be a growing, I hope, majority at some point that says, okay, there's some good here, there's some bad here. How do we fix it?
So at the end of the day, you're looking to keep Obamacare as it stands now, the ACA in place, and offer a number of things that are going to improve it, make it work better than it is now. Does that kind of sum up?
John, the basic concept that we ought to find a way to cover the close to 30 million Americans who didn't have coverage, who were ending up in our emergency rooms anyway, passing on costs to those of us like myself who've got private health insurance. Yeah, I think we ought to have a plan that does that. Do I think that the plan focused more on coverage than on cost containment? Yes. As a matter of fact, folks who can look back and will find there were a series of amendments that actually got more bipartisan. I think we had Olympia Snow and Susan Collins co-sponsor them, some amendments that were geared more at cost containment. I think there's more we can do on cost containment. I think this bill is heavy on coverage and lighter on cost containment. And then there's a whole lot of things that on the implementation just hasn't gone as I think a lot of folks expected, and those need to be fixed. But I would point out again to the listeners and others, I mean, this is not that much different than what happened with Medicare or even Social Security. You know, when you put a big new program in place, Congress never gets it right entirely the first time, and you always come back with a fix-it bill. I'd say the same thing with the Dodd-Frank bill. I was more involved with Dodd-Frank than I was with the Affordable Care Act. I can give you 25 different places where that needs to be fixed, but we've got this kind of there is a group in Congress that, you know, on these bills that you repeal or nothing,
right?
That I think are a little bit separated. That might make a good political soundbite, but I don't see it is going to become a reality regardless of what happens in this election cycle, at least as long as this president's still president.
Final question, Senator. I want to get to the Hobby Lobby case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now, because it's really bothering a lot of people out there. Basically, if I could just get your thoughts on that, how you think the Supreme Court will rule and why. You know,
John, I'm going to wait for the Supreme Court's decision on this. I think I understand, I understand folks' concerns about very strongly held religious beliefs. I also know that I've heard some of the arguments about how you can continue this along a continuum based upon your beliefs. If you didn't believe, for example, women should be in the workforce, should you be able to do that? If you other questions about that would fall into discrimination or not. You know, this case has been briefed. I hope the Supreme Court will act on it rapidly. I think that'll give us some more clarity here. And so I'm going to, I'm not going to weigh in on the merits at this point. Until after the Supreme Court reaches its decision.
Senator, final question. You're completing your first term in the U.S. Senate. What in your mind has been your biggest accomplishment?
Well, I think accomplishments we've taken around government performance in terms of trying legislation I've passed around government performance to try to make sure that government programs actually point out what works and what doesn't work, I think, is an area where we've made progress. I've got another bill up in this now in terms of government transparency called the Data Act. I'm actually working with Darrell Issa on the House. I think that's an area we've made progress. I think a lot of an area that I'm proud is that we've not reached the final agreement is, been a relentless voice on trying to work on the debt and deficit and put together the biggest bipartisan coalition in the Senate on that. Our so-called Gang of Six at one point had 46 senators in it, and I think we could have had 70 if we'd gotten to a vote. And being an advocate, on both sides, many times getting grief from the Democrats, actually even had AARP run ads against me on urging entitlement reform, and along with a major deal on tax reform. I think I've been very involved in, some of the parts of Dodd-Frank, Title I and Title II, that I worked with Bob Corker, that have got 85 votes. Some other parts of the bill didn't get that many votes, but that was an accomplishment. Right now, again, what I'm doing with Bob Corker on housing finance reform, broad bipartisan legislation that if could actually pass this session, that would be a really, really significant piece of legislation. We spent 2 years on it. Infrastructure financing that I'm working with Roy Blunt on. So I think what I would say is in a time when there's a lot of members of the Senate who spend all their time, criticizing the other side, whether you're Democrat or Republican, I think I've built a record that is based upon bipartisan legislation that is substantive and that I think is kind of about actually fixing problems in the country rather than simply blaming the other guy.
All right, that's going to be the final word. Senator Mark Warner, Democrat from Virginia, up for re-election this November. Senator, we want to thank you for joining us. Sorry about the problem we had
John,
earlier.
next time I'll call in, I'll make sure I got all my lines straight first. Thank you, and apologies to the listeners about the drop calls on the front end.
No worries. And if, Senator, if people want more information, where do they go?
Warner.senate.gov, or just Google me. And if you want to ask questions, or we try to respond to every inquiry we get. So love to have folks' thoughts and views.
Okay. Thanks, sir. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, John. Take care.